Why is it that so many years, while politics becomes the toy that lulls us into a false sense of security, our economies are controlled by people from other civilizations? Why is it? These are uncomfortable questions which we must pose and confront and answer if the mother continent is to realize our potential.
For decades, the world assumed Africa's financial story was simple. The continent relied on foreign aid, foreign banks, and foreign institutions to manage its money. The belief was so deeply rooted that even many Africans accepted it as an unchangeable reality. If a major project needed funding, it came from outside. If reserves needed managing, experts abroad handled them. Africa's wealth moved outward long before it ever benefited the people who produced it. But something historic happened this year, quietly, without global headlines or dramatic announcements. Africa didn't receive more aid. It didn't strike a new dependency deal. Instead, it did something far more important. It took control of its own money. Nearly $1 trillion in African assets, pension funds, reserves, and sovereign wealth funds are now managed locally by African institutions for African priorities. How did a continent once portrayed as dependent suddenly seize this kind of financial power? What exactly changed? Let's find out. For most of modern history, Africa's financial story followed the same predictable script. Money left the continent faster than it came in. Raw materials were exported, profits returned to foreign shareholders. Savings were deposited but managed offshore. Even national reserves were often handled under the guidance of international experts, whose job descriptions always sounded helpful but never translated into African control. And because this pattern lasted for decades, the world assumed it would last forever. Africa was the place that received aid, not the place that built capital. It was the place that borrowed money, not the place that grew it. But 2025 disrupted that script in a way nobody saw coming. The shift did not begin with a big announcement, a global summit, or a flashy reform package. It began with small technical decisions deep inside African institutions, the kind most people never pay attention to. A pension fund revised its mandate. A central bank increased its domestic investment capacity. A sovereign wealth fund quietly expanded its assets. At first, these changes looked unrelated. They had no political drama and no international press coverage. Yet they formed a pattern only visible when you stepped back far enough. That pattern revealed something extraordinary. Africa had begun managing its own money, not a few million, not a few projects. Nearly $1 trillion in accumulated assets, pulled from public pension systems, sovereign wealth funds, central bank reserves, and long-ignored financial pools, was now being controlled directly by African institutions, not overseen from abroad, not dictated by donors, not aligned with foreign priorities, controlled at home by Africans for African goals. To understand why this matters, you have to understand how rare it is. Most people don't realize that Africa's money was historically one of its most exported resources. The continent's minerals are left, its oil is left, and the profits from both were also left. But what makes 2025 different is that Africa's capital no longer follows that path. Instead of leaving the continent to be managed elsewhere, massive financial resources are staying within African borders, structured, controlled, and deployed by African expertise. This isn't symbolic pride, it's economic power. What makes the moment even more surprising is how quietly it happened. There were no grand speeches about independence, no fiery declarations about sovereignty. Africa didn't demand attention, it executed a plan. And that silence was intentional. Only once analysts from Global SWF and Reuters studied the numbers did the world realize a shift was taking place, a shift large enough to alter the continent's financial future, and small enough that nobody noticed it happening in real time. But a silent revolution always raises one question. If Africa were capable of managing nearly $1 trillion of its own wealth, why didn't it take control earlier? The answer lies in the pressure, the unexpected shock that pushed the continent to act. What forced Africa to stop depending on the outside world and finally take charge of its own financial destiny? What forced Africa to finally take charge of its own money was not ambition, ideology, or a sudden wave of confidence. It was something far more brutal, the collapse of the system Africa depended on. For decades, foreign aid acted like a financial cushion. Whenever budgets fell short, donors stepped in. Whenever governments needed external validation, development partners provided it. And because this routine lasted so long, many African states built their economic planning around the assumption that aid would always be available. But history doesn't keep its promises. In 2024 and 2025, a perfect storm hit donor nations. Economic slowdowns, inflation spikes, political instability, wars in Europe and the Middle East, and rising domestic costs. Aid budgets were quietly slashed. Some programs were delayed, others were canceled. What Africa received was not a warning, it was silence. And in that silence, African governments faced an uncomfortable truth. The world was no longer going to rescue them. For many countries, this moment felt like standing in a room where the lights suddenly shut off. You reach for the switch and nothing happens. You call for help and nobody answers. At first, there was panic, because Africa had built entire development strategies around external money. Roads, hospitals, education reforms, energy projects, all heavily anchored in partnerships that now looked fragile. But this shock did something unexpected. It forced African leaders, economists, and financial institutions to look inward, not out of nationalism, but out of necessity. And what they found changed everything. Africa already had money, a lot of it. Public pension funds that had been treated as administrative necessities turned out to be massive pools of capital. Central bank reserves were healthier than many people realized. Sovereign wealth funds, previously small and scattered, had the potential to become serious financial players. Even mineral revenues, when properly consolidated, represented huge investment opportunities. Aid did not disappear and leave Africa empty-handed. Aid disappeared and revealed that Africa had been underestimating its own financial muscle for decades. This realization created a psychological shift long before it created a financial one. African governments stopped asking, "Who will fund us?" and started asking, "What can we fund ourselves?" That single change in mindset triggered institutional reforms, updated investment mandates, and regulations that allowed African capital to stay home instead of traveling abroad. Suddenly, decisions that once felt risky, managing reserves locally, expanding sovereign wealth funds, and investing pension money domestically, became logical, even necessary. The aid shock did not weaken Africa. It woke Africa. But waking up is one thing. Building a system that can handle nearly $1 trillion is another. The continent needed stronger financial structures, institutions capable of holding, managing, and multiplying its wealth. And that step required planning, discipline, and quiet, methodical restructuring behind the scenes. So the next question is clear. Once Africa realized it had the wealth, how did it build the institutions strong enough to manage it? The moment Africa realized it was sitting on far more wealth than it ever acknowledged, a new challenge appeared. Awareness doesn't equal capacity. Knowing you have money is different from being able to manage it, protect it, and make it grow. For decades, outsiders controlled African assets, not because Africans were incapable, but because the continent lacked the institutional machinery to do it independently. If Africa truly wanted to take control of nearly $1 trillion, it needed a financial backbone strong enough to carry it. That is exactly what Africa began building, quietly, deliberately, without announcing it to the world. The first pillar came from an unexpected place: public pension funds. Most people think of pensions as slow, bureaucratic systems that simply pay retirees. But African pension funds were massive pools of capital, stable and long-term. When reforms allowed them to invest more strategically, something important happened. They became engines of domestic development. Money that once slept in foreign accounts started funding African infrastructure, African housing, African energy, and African technology. The second pillar was central banks. For years, African central banks operated under frameworks influenced by international institutions. But as aid declined and currencies remained volatile, central banks began tightening control over reserves and strengthening domestic financial rules. Sub-Saharan Africa now holds around $170 billion in reserves. modest compared to global giants, but significant when aligned with a strong financial strategy. More importantly, these reserves were no longer automatically tied to foreign management or foreign priorities. The third and most dramatic pillar was the explosive rise of sovereign wealth funds (SWFs). The world barely noticed that 2025 became the year Africa launched 5 new SWFs in a single year. Botswana's BSWF, DRC's FISRDC, Eswatini's ESWF, Kenya's KSWF, and Oyo State's OSWF in Nigeria. These weren't symbolic announcements. They were strategic structures designed to hold national wealth, invest it, grow it, and protect future generations from external shocks. And while these newcomers emerged, the Libyan Investment Authority, already managing $68 billion, remained the continent's heavyweight fund. Taken together, these institutions formed a network capable of something Africa never had before: sustained, internally directed financial power. Each fund, bank, and regulatory body became a gear in a machine built for one purpose: keeping Africa's wealth inside Africa. And all of this happened without global celebration, without dramatic headlines, without Western commentary. Why? Because Africa didn't build these institutions to impress anyone. It built them because the world's economic landscape was shifting, and Africa needed structures that could withstand those shifts. But the institutional transformation raises a bigger question. Why did Africa suddenly feel confident enough, even bold enough, to trust itself with this level of financial autonomy? What global change gave Africa the courage to step into full financial control? Let's pause for a second to say big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Africa didn't suddenly grow confident in a vacuum. Confidence is rarely born from internal desire alone. It usually emerges when the world around you changes, when old powers weaken, when global attention shifts elsewhere, when the economic balance tilts just enough to create space for someone new to rise. That is exactly what happened. Africa gained courage because the world that used to control the financial narrative was no longer stable enough to maintain that control. The Western economic system, the same system that once positioned itself as Africa's financial guardian, entered a period of turbulence. Inflation surged, energy crises spread, political divisions deepened, and domestic spending skyrocketed. As these pressures grew, Western governments became more concerned with their own survival than with managing Africa's affairs. Suddenly, Africa was no longer in the spotlight. It was no longer being micromanaged. It was no longer being told what to do or how to run its finances. The usual noise from abroad went quiet, and that silence became a window of opportunity. At the same time, Asian economies, especially China, India, and Southeast Asian nations, were shifting the global center of gravity eastward. New trade routes emerged. New financial partnerships opened up. New development models demonstrated that countries do not need Western approval to succeed. Asia's rise showed Africa something important. Sovereignty is achievable, even against centuries of economic hierarchy. This global recalibration created psychological permission for Africa to pursue its own trajectory without apology.
We don't interfere in the internal affairs of African countries, impose our will on the African countries, attach any political condition on the economic aid for Africa.
Inside the continent, another transformation was taking place. A new generation of African economists, technocrats, and policymakers rose into leadership. They were younger, more assertive, and trained in the world's top institutions, but unlike their predecessors, they returned home with a mission. They weren't interested in repeating old dependency models. They believed in African capability, African institutions, and African decision-making. They saw the shaky global economy not as a threat, but as a strategic opening. Suddenly, the idea of managing African wealth locally didn't feel reckless. It felt necessary. The world was too unstable to rely on external systems, too self-focused to prioritize Africa, and too fragmented to police African financial choices. The continent realized it had one clear advantage. It could act while everyone else was distracted. But gaining confidence doesn't erase reality. reports from Global SWF still showed an uncomfortable statistic. Africa controls just 1% of global reserves, 1% of global pension assets, and 1% of all sovereign wealth funds. If Africa is rising, why is its global share still so small? Does that mean Africa is weak, or is the 1% actually more powerful than it looks? That question defines the next stage of Africa's financial evolution. How can a continent with only 1% of the world's managed wealth turn that small share into long-term financial leverage? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. At first glance, Africa's numbers look small. 1% of the world's sovereign wealth funds, 1% of public pension assets, 1% of central bank reserves. Analysts love to highlight this because it makes Africa appear irrelevant in global finance. But the truth is the exact opposite. That 1% is not a weakness. It is the beginning of compounding, and compounding is the one force no global power can stop once it starts. Africa's 1% is not a reflection of inability. It is a reflection of underutilization. The continent's population is exploding, its cities are growing faster than anywhere in the world, its demand for infrastructure is unmatched, and its natural resources remain the deepest untapped reserves on Earth. Even a small amount of strategically controlled capital, when paired with rapid demographic and economic growth, acts like a match thrown onto dry grass. It may look like a tiny flame, but it spreads in ways no one expects. The 1% becomes even more powerful when you understand one key fact. Africa just started keeping its money at home. For decades, African wealth left the continent and enriched foreign banks, foreign investors, and foreign pension systems. Now that the continent is finally retaining and managing its own capital, the multiplier effect has shifted. Every dollar held inside Africa supports African credit markets, African businesses, African infrastructure, and African industry. In other words, the compounding no longer benefits London or New York. It benefits Nairobi, Lagos, Cairo, Kigali, Accra, Dar es Salaam, and Johannesburg. Here's where it gets more interesting. The structure of Africa's economies makes growth faster and more dramatic than in older, saturated markets. Europe and North America have aging populations, stagnant industries, and limited room for expansion. Africa is the opposite. It is still building cities, building roads, building energy grids, building industries, building digital economies. That means every dollar invested inside the continent produces real, visible impact. So while Africa's 1% looks small on charts, it is operating in the fastest growing environment in the world. But there is another, deeper layer to why the 1% matters. It represents a mental baseline, a starting point, a reference that the continent can measure itself against. 5 years from now, that 1% may become 3%. 10 years later, 6%. Then 10%. Financial independence doesn't explode overnight. It accumulates quietly, slowly, and then suddenly. The moment Africa hit $1 trillion in locally managed assets, something irreversible happened. The compounding began on African soil. And once compounding starts, the world cannot put the genie back in the bottle. Africa is no longer waiting for external permission, external capital, or external leadership. It has started building momentum from within, and momentum is the most dangerous currency in global economics. But this raises a final critical question, one that determines whether Africa's rise stops at numbers or transforms into genuine sovereignty. What internal shift must occur for Africa's financial awakening to become permanent, unstoppable, and generational? For Africa's financial awakening to become permanent, the most important transformation had nothing to do with money, institutions, reserves, or sovereign wealth funds. Those things matter. They matter enormously, but they only work when one deeper shift happens first. Africa must believe in the legitimacy of its own wealth. For decades, the continent was told, directly and indirectly, that it was poor, dependent, unstable, and incapable of managing complex financial systems. Even when Africa generated wealth, the world insisted it needed oversight, guidance, or support. Over time, this narrative seeped into the psychology of institutions, policymakers, and citizens themselves. But something changed the moment Africa officially crossed the threshold of $1 trillion in locally managed assets. The number wasn't just financial, it was cultural, emotional, and symbolic. It shattered the illusion that Africa needed the outside world to validate its economic choices. It replaced old stories of scarcity with new evidence of abundance. It forced the continent to confront a truth hidden in plain sight. Africa was never poor. Africa was mismanaged, underestimated, and structurally weakened by external dependence. Once that psychological barrier was cracked, everything else became possible. African policymakers began designing strategies not based on donor expectations, but on continental priorities. Institutions started trusting African expertise over external consultants. Central banks moved from defensive monetary policies to proactive investment strategies. Sovereign wealth funds emerged not as experiments, but as long-term commitments tied to national pride and generational responsibility. Even pension funds, long ignored, suddenly mattered as sources of stability and transformation. But the psychological shift extended far beyond institutions. Citizens began to see development differently. They no longer viewed progress as something that arrives from abroad. They began seeing it as something financed by African labor, African savings, African innovation, and African decision-making. This shift is subtle but powerful. When a population stops waiting for external saviors, governments are forced to govern with more discipline, more creativity, and more accountability. The mindset change also altered Africa's global posture. Instead of negotiating from weakness, African nations now enter financial discussions from a place of ownership. A continent that controls $1 trillion of its own capital negotiates differently. It partners differently. It invests differently. It refuses conditions that undermine sovereignty. And most importantly, it learns to say no, a word Africa was historically discouraged from using. This psychological revolution is what makes Africa's financial rise irreversible. Money can fluctuate, markets can shake, global powers can shift. But once a continent realizes its strength, you cannot convince it to return to dependency. Once a generation sees that African wealth can build African futures, the old narrative collapses permanently. The rise of African-controlled assets is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of a new economic identity. One where the continent finally funds its own destiny. One where growth is not imported, it is generated. One where sovereignty is not a slogan, it is a balance sheet reality. Africa's $1 trillion moment is not just a number. It is a declaration, a turning point, a psychological break from a century of economic dependency. And now, for the first time in modern history, the continent steps forward with the confidence to say, Africa will rise because Africa is financing the rise itself. Do you think Africa's rise will stay quiet, or is the world about to feel its impact? Let us know in the comment section what happens when a continent that was once controlled finally controls its own wealth. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.